around, but Ezra won't let me walk around because I'm on TV. You all are on TV too if you talk, so be careful. I'm Tom Kelly, and I'm sort of an emergency fill-in for I don't know what was supposed to happen today. But it's a great opportunity for me to think with you about something that I don't really know very much about. And that is mostly this building here, which is everybody's paying a lot of attention to because of an event that happened in 2019 that we all know about. The roof and the spire and parts of one of the towers burned disastrously, but it could have been a lot worse. And so for the last 5 years, they've been working on this Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And it's expected to reopen about 10 days from now. So if you happen to be a high-ranking bishop in the Roman Catholic Church, you might get to go to the opening Mass, but if you're not, this will have to do. Anyhow, it's interesting to think about this on Christ the King Sunday when we think about Solomon's temple and about the physical places. This is a building that's a religious monument, yes, but it's also a kind of a civic monument, isn't it? It's placed right smack in the center of the city of Paris, and it's a way of saying we love God, but we're very, very rich and important here. Isn't it interesting that you can make that same statement with a single building? We don't have that. The United States, we're not that way because we're not, at the beginning, North America didn't have many Christians on it. But when it did, there were lots of different kinds, and so there was no sense in which we would all get together and build a single religious edifice that was the temple of God, the way you can in Catholic countries. I mean, of course, when this was built in the 11th and 12th centuries, 12th and 13th centuries, there weren't different religious denominations. There was one, so that makes it a little bit easier too. But you think of lots of groups of populations who erected the biggest building, the grandest building they possibly could to the glory of God. We have things that look like that in the United States. We have Anglicans. There's Washington Cathedral. There's the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, each of which is sort of the size of a grand English or continental cathedral. But where would you expect the biggest cathedral of all to be? Rome. So why is there not a great big religious edifice in the very center of Rome? I guess it's because Rome was there and it wasn't, Christianity wasn't there yet. So along comes Constantine and he makes these basilicas, but all around the edges of Rome. So St. John Lateran is out on the edge. St. Paul's outside the walls. St. Peter's Basilica, they're all on the edges because that's the way you sneak Christianity into the city of Rome. So there may be something about the placement of the building having something to do with when it's made and where it's made and who made it. But at least in this case, it's the center of the city, the center of the religious life of the city, and also the center of intellectual life, lots of other things too. It's an early, not the earliest, but an early example of Gothic architecture, and much the grandest so far. A lot of slides I'm going to show you here are lent to me by my good friend, Professor Caroline Bruzelius from Duke University, who has studied this building for her whole scholarly career and has had the good fortune to be in the cathedral and on the towers and all that sort of thing while they're doing the rebuilding. So she says they made some discoveries about how this building was made and how Gothic architecture was done that nobody knew before. So there's a slightly happy side to the disastrous fire that took place. But the basic idea is it's bigger than most of the other Gothic cathedrals that you know by a fair amount. That's Notre Dame on the right, which is a lot taller than many others. And you get the basic idea that there's the weight of the roof puts weight on things, and then the weight is distributed outward, so that although the floor plan has a lot of different things. Each of these has a lower roof. The roof of this section is here, the roof of this section is here, the roof, and this is the first use of big, lots of flying buttresses. You know what I mean by that. The thing that carries the weight outward and distributes the weight of the roof, and the whole thing is just kept in place by all sorts of tension. So it looks very complicated on the outside, and it's a little bit like the Pompidou Center in a way. You see the structure on the outside, and on the inside, you have this serenity and this repeating units of architecture that look like they could go on forever. So in a way, it's a kind of an inside-out building. So now we're looking down the nave, but then there's an aisle on either side of the nave, and an aisle on either side of that with a still lower roof, and then chapels sticking out into the wind, so that the floor plan actually looks sort of like this. There's a lot of floor, but only this central part is the soaring part that goes all the way up to the high part. This has a lower roof, this is a lower roof still, with buttresses outside that you don't see, and then these are chapels that are inserted into the side walls. So the general layout, nobody knows exactly what it looked like in the 13th century, 12th or 13th century, but there's some idea that the choir looked a little bit like this. There was a big jubé closing off the choir from the nave. It's not like you went to church and sat in the nave and heard or saw anything. The canons of the cathedral do their work in here, and then there's the high altar and so on. And here's just a couple of guys on the tower working on some of the stone. Some idea of the scale of the two west towers. One of the things they found that they didn't expect to find was these metal clamps, whatever they call them, these iron clamps with lead seals on the ends of them, so that apparently it has to do with moisture rusting the iron, that holds the tops of these things are found in here, holding whole columns of masonry together at the top. Nobody knew they were there until they got busy working on this thing. Turns out, the Parthenon used iron bars too to hold things together. It's not totally new, but just nobody knew that Notre Dame had been put together with things like this. So here is one of them, and here's part of the lead seal on one end of this before they did anything about it. Another construction thing that they sort of found out about and didn't know much about was these columns here. These are the big round columns that go down to the floor. Then above them are these columns that go actually all the way up to the top, crossing through several rows of horizontal stuff. And these things are not, these are detached from the wall. They're not carved out of the stone that's behind them, but they're attached to the wall or to each other. And I don't know what this slide is a demonstration of, maybe how these things are carved. The endilis shafts, these things here, are made, they too are attached with other size ones of these metal rods, top and bottom, and carefully arranged so that they hold a whole set of the masonry behind them together. So they're attached to the wall, but they're not carved as part of the wall, if you see what I mean. And it helps strengthen the whole thing. And so, the effect of this, here goes these columns that go from here all the way through this and through all of that, all the way up to the roof, making a magnificent thing to look at. I'm a music guy, though, so I'm really interested in knowing what it sounds like. I'd like to know sort of the sounds that might have been heard in this building over the various centuries. And clearly the most obvious and the most long-lasting sound is Gregorian chant. That Latin music that comes from we don't know when, but we have it as far back as the 8th century, and some people are still singing it. They're still singing it at Notre Dame, tue. How wonderful. Métis. So here's a page of a manuscript made for and used at Notre Dame. This is Easter Day, as you see. I'm sure you can very clearly see the introit for Easter Day, Resurrexi, at Advuk Tecum, that we all know, because we're regular churchgoers. And then down here is the Alleluia for Easter Day. Starting here, I think there's an arrow. That's the Alleluia, and then Pascha Nostrum Immolata Est, Christ our Passover, a sacrifice for us. Then you repeat the Alleluia. So, Alleluia, so something like that. Everybody all over the world would know that. And so it would be easy for us all to join in. And then a soloist sings the verse, and then we go back and sing the Alleluia again. So everywhere in Christendom they sing this piece on Easter. And this is the version they use in Paris. In the 12th and 13th century, the Cathedral of Paris had, in addition to all the canons, they had people who worked for the canons, sort of vicars, who were hired as singing men. And many of them were also music theorists, composers, people who worked in the university that was growing out of the cathedral school. This building was also the generator of the University of Paris. And one of the things they seem to have figured out, and in the 12th and 13th centuries, we music historians talk about the school of Notre Dame, a particular kind of music that was made for and sung in this cathedral that survives to us in a couple of really beautiful books. We're so lucky. If those books were gone, we wouldn't really know. But the basic thing is, somebody once said to somebody else, Bill, instead of singing this Alleluia, going Alleluia, why don't you sing the Alleluia and I'll make up something else to go along with it at the same time. Fancy word, polyphony or harmony or something like that. Singing two notes instead of one. You say, yeah, but that's kind of boring. Why don't you just sing, ah, and I'll go, ah, and when it comes time for the second note, I'll point to you and you sing, le, and I'll do some more stuff like that. And we'll take the Alleluia and we'll really put flourishes on it. And that's just what they did. And here is a whole book of that kind of stuff where Bill is singing the long notes and I'm singing the florid parts. So here's the Alleluia here. Alleluia. Maybe you can see that this is music that the staves come in pairs. The words are under every other musical staff. So the idea is these two musical staves are performed at the same time. Ah, or whatever the right note is. Ah. It's really wonderful, mesmerizing music. There's the beginning of the Alleluia, and then it continues over here. This is the chant. Alleluia. Just the opening notes of the Alleluia. Then you have to sing the Hallelujah again. And then somebody sings the verse with a whole bunch of that stuff, and then you come back and do the Hallelujah again. Mass is going to be long this Easter. But it's going to get longer still, because Bill and I can do that, because there's just two of us, and if I'm singing the upper part, I just go, and he sings the next note. But they soon began to think, I don't know what they thought, but what we have after this as a slightly later phenomenon is music where there are two or even three voices added to the chant that all sing at the same time. And when you do that, you really need to coordinate it. You've got to figure out who sings what when. That is, you have to figure out a way to notate how long the note is, what we call rhythm. And there's no indication here at all of how long any of these notes is. And it's fine. It works fine because Bill and I know what we're doing, and we might have practiced in the sacristy and not nudge him or do whatever, and we can do it. But if you want three people singing in addition to the chant, you got to figure something out. And this is a thing they figured out. They figured out a way to notate rhythm. The earliest musical notation we have that indicates how long a note lasts comes from the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And what they did was take the existing signs. The musical notation of the chant had started with little marks like this. And then when they decided they were going to start writing with a Gothic pen, they took these signs and made them, they just became stuff like this, which is what we were just seeing in that chant manuscript. They have different shapes, but they mean nothing. The fact that you have little diamonds or things with a tail or things without a tail means nothing. Means nothing rhythmically, I mean. As you see, they just derived from using a Gothic pen to write the old-fashioned neumes, as they're called. But what these guys did is say, hey, why don't we just decide, arbitrarily, but we'll all agree, that when we see certain patterns of notes, we will understand them to mean certain kinds of rhythms. So let's just say we have long notes and short notes. So let's agree that whenever we see a group of three stuck together, followed by any number of groups of two, we'll always read it, the three, as long, short, long, and all the twos is short, long. So this is long, short, long, short, long, short, long, otherwise known as Here We Come A-Wassailing. And whenever you see a group of three followed by groups of two, so this is Gently Down the Stream. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not from the appearance of the individual notes. It's from the groupings. If you have a group of three followed by a bunch of twos, it's long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, ad infinitum. And there are other patterns. When you have twos that start first and end with threes, it's short, long, short, long, short, long, short. Yeah. And so on. So, here is a beautiful page from a beautiful manuscript of all of this kind of stuff, made for use and used at Notre Dame, now in the Laurentian Library in Florence. We call it the Florence manuscript, but it's not. It's the Notre Dame manuscript. And here's a section. Well, here for one thing, here's a place up at the top. Maybe you can see that these two lines are meant to go together, where you have a group of three followed by a whole bunch of twos. You see what I mean? This is a group of three notes and then two, 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 two. It looks like chant, but once you see that pattern, you say, I know what that is. That's da 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 da. And this one, here's three. This is threes followed by a bunch of twos. Da 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 da, ya da 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 dum ba bum. You can read it, and you can read it in rhythm. Totally cool. By the way, this wonderful little picture says something about the intellectual life that's going on, not only in the cathedral, but in Paris, in the cathedral school, and in the schools across the river in the so-called Latin Quarter. This is a picture of the seven liberal arts. There's the trivial arts at the top, the trivium, the language arts. So here's grammar, trying to figure out this text. And here's logic, working things out. And this is rhetoric, making the speech. These are the three language arts, the trivial arts. And then we come to the quadrivium, the mathematical arts. So here is arithmetic, counting on her fingers. Here is music. You see the gesture of singing. Music is, after all, the study of the relationships of numbers, and the relationships of numbers to each other, but to our inner souls, and to the world and the planets and the motions of the planets and the sounds that we hear and the sounds that we don't hear. The science of proportional numbers is music. We hear a little bit of it, but most of music we don't hear, we just study. And then here, of course, is geometry, the measuring the world, and astronomy, measuring the planets, the universe, everything. So these are the quadrivium, the numerical arts, and these are the language arts. What are they doing in the book of church music? Well, anyhow, so here is one of these pieces that uses that kind of musical notation. This is the same Alleluia that we've looked at twice before, the Alleluia for Easter. But this is for three voices, and the chant is here. Ah, le, lu, oh, oh. And then these two people are going to sing. This is written in those patterns that allow us to know what the rhythm of these upper parts is. The first time we can read music in rhythms, it doesn't mean that people haven't sung music in rhythm. People have always marched, people have always danced, people have always done all the things that require regular rhythm, but we've never had it written down so that we know what it is until now. Here's a place. They start off with a different pattern than the one we talked about, but when we get to right here, I don't know if you can see, this is 3, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. When we get to here, they'll go da 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 da. When they start, it's da 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 dum bum da dum bum. So different. They had 6 different patterns. Anyway, it is, I think, an amazing sound that makes me think a little. Well, see what you think. just the Hallelujah. And we got the whole verse for another 2 or 3 pages. What do you think? I mean, it reminds me kind of American minimalism. Something like that. Just mesmerizing, yeah.
I just wanted, when they give them sheet music, did they have this or did they have to know it in their heads?
I don't know. This book is about this big. This is not the book you sing from. So if they had some kind of a cheat sheet or something, all those things are lost to us. This seems to me, though, almost impossible to memorize. So I think they must have had something that they could a slate, or, but we really don't know, I'm sorry to say. Why do people ask me always the hard questions?
How would, just a small point though, how would they determine tempo? It seems like they're together.
I don't know. I mean, I know that this recording was made for me, and I know the guys who sang it, and we talked about it, and it seems like if you went, would that seem about right to you? That seems to not feel a little slow. I don't know. Somewhere in the middle. Bill?
What about vowel sounds versus consonants? I didn't hear any consonants.
Well, you did when they went and then they went they.
Yeah.
But there was a lot. The proportion of vowels to consonant was about 99 to 1, and then they went. They think anyway. I don't know. You can only sing on a vowel, so it's mostly vowel. You can't go very well. You know. Yeah.
Quick question. You mentioned that this was the beginning of rhythmic notation at the time. When did rhythmic notation, as we know it today, emerge?
Oh, in the 14th century. They began to say, let's stop doing these patterns and decide that one shape is a certain length and another shape is a different length, which is a completely different concept from what these guys are doing. Bill?
So God gives us 5 senses, and the architectural historians of Gothic cathedrals not unnaturally emphasize one of them, sight. To what extent can we deduce anything about the design of these buildings for sound?
I've talked to lots of art historians who want to find some connection. I have never yet found a convincing one. But I do think that there's something about this, about the swirling of this music that you imagine that the resonance of a big Gothic building like this would enhance in a way that you hear it. It seems to me you hear this music kind of like a cloud of incense or something, rather than there's a lot of little details. It's also true, though, that it was sung in the choir of Notre Dame, and the building wasn't finished yet when this music was composed. They had built from the west end, from the altar end, through probably they had finished the transept, but the nave wasn't there yet. So it would be resonant, but not as resonant as it is now. So I don't know. It's a terrible problem, and a lot of art historians and architectural historians want there to be some connection with liturgy. But if that were true, then the fact that there are round churches, and there are square churches, and there are long churches, and there are broad churches, and exactly the same liturgy is used in all of them, it's not at all clear that the purpose of the building is acoustic.
Well, having been in one of these, when you sit in a pew, it's just this swirling.
You just hear
It's not
sound
directly
cloud.
at you. And I was thinking because the choir and people said they're way up in front, behind, in their own little area. And for that sound to come out, it's got to go way up and bounce. And so by the time it gets to you, it's kind of a jumbled mess.
You know what? I don't think it was designed for you. I think it was designed for God and for the people who were actually participants. Because the liturgy, if you think about it, the liturgy is not really an audience thing. The liturgy is something that everybody is a part of. And so in principle, it's designed for this to be our voices also. Okay, one more question, and then I got some more stuff to say, and then we'll put questions at the end, okay? Because otherwise we'll never Yeah, please.
I was curious about that picture you showed, the 7 sciences,
Uh-huh.
and you described music as understood as a portion of numbers. I was curious, like at this time, would they have also seen music as sort of a demonstration of divine creativity, or like an inspiration as well as a science?
You know, it's interesting. This music is almost the earliest music we have that has the name of a composer attached to it. There's a man named Perotinus, Perotin the Great, they call him, who made music like this, and we have a 14th century English university student in Paris who wrote some notes. The only reason we know this guy's name, he said, he made the big book of organum, that's what they call this kind of music, including the pieces called this, this, and this. And those pieces are in this book. So we actually know that, but the idea of a composer is one that hadn't surfaced very much. The idea of monastic anonymity, the idea that you offer it up to God or that God speaks through you. It's not like I made this, it's just I'm a vehicle for this. And that pattern is slightly changing maybe right now in this period. That's a whole other talk that I know, another thing that I don't really know anything about. But this music, it may sound like modern minimalism, but it also, I mean, doesn't it remind you also of, it's a very large thing made out of very tiny units. You know, it's just the same little short, long pattern over and over and over again. But it goes together to make something enormous, like the big rose windows of Notre Dame, or like the bays along the nave. You know, just one thing after another. So, another sound, of course, is the bells. Maybe you know that one of the towers burned. The 2 west towers have big wooden frames inside with stone on the outside. So they're really just chimneys for. One of the towers burned very badly, and the bells were ruined and sort of melted. The other tower, the bells were okay. So the bells of Notre Dame go back a long way. The oldest surviving bell now is the bourdon, the biggest bass bell, and it survives, and it's called Emmanuel. But it has been recast like all bells. All bells get recast every now and then, every 100 years or so. Something goes wrong with them. You take them back to the foundry, you melt them down, you make the bell again. So all of them have been made and remade. But they lost a lot of them, and these are the new ones. These are the new ones that are just about to have been installed in the Tower of Notre Dame. This is what they probably will sound like. This is what they used to sound like. They say is these are the 8 bells that were saved from the fire. So these were, and they've been reinstalled, and this is the bells ringing for the first time as the cathedral is restored. Of course, the thing that I like best about Notre Dame is the organ, the great organ of Notre Dame, which, like the bells, has been redone many, many, many times. The organ case, as it is now, is an 18th century case by an organ builder named Clicquot. But of course, there were organs going back to about the 14th century in Notre Dame, and we have a very long series of very distinguished organists. One, the oldest one that we can hear play is a guy named Louis Vierne, very famous organist. And he wrote a lot of cool music, but the only surviving video of Louis Vierne playing, he was the organist for the last 20 years or so of the 19th century and the first 30-some years of the 20th century. And he survived into the age, barely into the age of movies, and here he is, Louis Vierne, playing Bach on the grand organ of He does show that you make no movement that you don't need to make. And he was, they're great pieces by Vierne. Don't take that as an example of what Louis Vierne's organ music is like. Here's a video of the organist. I went and heard him play several times, who was the organist for many years from the 50s to the 70s, Pierre Cochereau. And Cochereau was one of the great organists like Marcel Dupré and Vidor and all sorts of other people who were great virtuosos. In France, the organist is considered a great artist, the same way the violin virtuoso and the piano virtuoso are. They're not, unfortunately, considered that way usually in our world. But anyway, they also had a way of doing music at Mass, but this is before the Second Vatican Council, and when I was a student in Paris, it was also before that. The Mass was mostly organ music, with a little bit of words. You played what was called an entrée, and almost all the music in all the Parisian churches was improvised by the organist. Sometimes on the basis of today's Gregorian chant, sometimes just for the fun of it. You would ask one of your students, give me a tune. And you'd go da, 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 and then out would come this huge toccata on ba, 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 or whatever you suggested. Entrée, which is the entrance thing. Then there would be some readings and maybe a sermon. My organ teacher used to go back behind the organ and smoke his pipe during the sermon. And then you have the offertoire, where you improvise a very long offertory thing. So yes, the collection is taken up, but the offertory also leads you all the way up through the canon of the Mass up to the words of consecration. And then you start playing a piece called the Élévation, very quiet and very meditative for the consecration of the host and then you play a communion. You play music for the communion, and then there's the blessing at the end, and then you play a sortie, great big loud piece for people to leave. And so you have 1 hour of organ music and 10 minutes of, 15 minutes of talk. That's all changed now, but the organists are still super good at doing this. This is Cochereau improvising a piece for a television program. It's called Antenne 2. So there's, okay, he said, I'm going to take the letters from your television, from your station. And he goes, da, da, da. I've forgotten how he derives them. And then he does a huge long piece based on the letters of the television station. And he starts with a fugue. You can see him adding one voice after another. And he goes on and on and on. And this is only 3 or 4. I've cut a lot out of the middle, I'm sorry to say. But
Pierre Cochereau, donc, l'orgue de Notre Dame.
the best part is when you stop. You have several seconds of resonance. You'll note that the console has been changed since the time of Louis Vierne, and it's been changed again since Cochereau's time. They have 5 keyboards, but you notice he was almost always on the bottom keyboard. And the reason for that is that now we have all sorts of electrical things. You can punch a little button or step on a little toaster and change all the stops instantly. Whereas it used to be, you would need to have 2 or 3 assistants, and if you wanted to go from soft to loud, you'd have to pull out a lot of stuff, really, or set up 5 different sounds that you could readily move to. Now that you find that they mostly use those upper keyboards when they're playing soft music that wants to have a solo clarinet or a solo oboe or something, that can be set up. But he and then his successor, whom I'm going to show you right now, one of his successors, just tend to stay on the bottom keyboard and just touch different things with their toe or with their thumb, and the sound changes. So you kind of wonder why they bother having all 5 of those keyboards, but they do use them from time to time. A successor to Cochereau, they decided to divide it up among several organists. And there's a guy named Olivier Latry, who is really a remarkable organist. He was one of the 3 organists in Notre Dame up until the thing burned. And he's also a wonderful organist. Here he is, again with a slightly rebuilt keyboard, improvising a sortie at Notre Dame. And you can see in the multi-screen thing the procession leaving and his feet and so forth. But I've also chopped a lot of the middle out. I'm sorry, we just don't have time. But you can find all this stuff on YouTube or on the web somewhere, if you like. Survived very well, but it was full of dust and all sorts of stuff, so it's all been taken out. Everything is being cleaned, and it's going to be put back, and it will open along with everything else next week. Just before we quit, let me show you another picture from this music book that we were looking at before, because it has its intellectual aspect, the one had the 7 liberal arts. This is the frontispiece of this book. And maybe sort of answer some of the questions we're talking about. It shows what Boethius, the consolation of philosophy guy who also wrote about music, but how Boethius thought about music, and this is put as the preface of this book. There are 3 kinds of music. One is musica mundana. It means the music of the world, what we would call the music of the spheres. That is, here's Lady Music with her Jedi Knight lightsaber, pointing to the moon and the stars and the sun and everything. It's just those proportions that govern the motions of the heavenly bodies and that keep everything in order moving. And it's what we call music of the spheres. It's music, but we don't hear it. But without those proportions and balances, nothing would be here. So that's musica mundana. This is musica humana, human music, and that doesn't mean vocal music. What that means is those proportions and balances that regulate the relationship of the mind to the body and the various humors within the body so that everything stays in equilibrium. Those proportions, if they're right, make us healthy, and if they're not, they make us not healthy. But that's music too. And then finally, and least important, musica instrumentalis. That is the music that we can actually hear. Some of it's vocal, some of it's instrumental, but it's a small portion of the whole thing about music. So one last thing. This is a reconstruction of what would have happened if the spire that burned, the wooden spire on the top of the cathedral, actually had been put there by Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century. What would have happened if it had fallen just 2 meters different way? There's the fire. There's the spire falling. Here's the hole it made in the roof. Here's what might have happened if it had 2 meters further west.
Oh, wow.
It's not over because we lose some of the buttresses. And then the side walls. It burned like a torch because it was just a wooden construction. We are so lucky. And a week from now, they're going to reopen the thing, ring all the bells, play the organ again, have a big festive mass, and a lot of masses. And I think we're all probably looking forward to going back and seeing, one of us, we were talking before, all these buildings were built to be new. They weren't built to be old. They weren't built to have the accumulation of dirt and dust over the century. And what we're going to see when we go to Notre Dame next is a brand new shining cathedral. The way it was always meant to look by the people who built it, and in a way that we've never seen it. So that's going to be fun. Do go when the organ's playing, because there's nothing like it. These guys won't be singing that weird old music anymore, I don't think. You can hear it. Anyway, it's a great building, and it's a great privilege to get to talk about it. Thank you.
You know, Lydia from Symphony Hall 2 months ago.
Yeah, right.
They sang some organ symphony. Phenomenal musician. I saw him in rehearsal.
He's a great musician, but the Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony is a walk in the park compared to what he was doing. Yeah.
It was great to hear that organ. You know,
Oh, yeah. He's a wonderful player.
So for my work, I am a chaplain, and I met a man who was an organ repair person. He grew up in Bermuda and lived out here, worked in the North Shore, but he would be called kind of throughout Boston too, because he said it's a small group of people that does this work.
Right.
But he said he would get called sometimes early in the Sunday morning for an emergency to fix an organ so it could be playing for mass or services. And I was curious, what are some of the common things that you would have to repair?
The thing that usually goes wrong is what's called a cipher. That means a note that won't stop playing. Anything else you can, if some stops don't work, you use some other stops, you play softly, you play it on the trumpet. You can fake it unless you have a cipher that plays a really, really loud A flat and your hymn is in D or something, you know. And depending on what kind of organ you have, there can be different reasons for a cipher. It could be just the key stuck down mechanically and you do it up like that. It can be that there's the thing underneath the pallet underneath the windway that opens that is stuck down. Then you have to get into the wind chest and you can't really do that. You have to figure out a way to make the cipher stop, and what you usually have to do on a Sunday morning, because you haven't got time, is to go in, crawl into the organ, find the pipe, and pull it out of its hole. So that the wind is going, but it's not playing that loud A flat. That's the usual thing. Other kinds of things, if it's a mechanical organ, it's usually that or something like that. If the blower doesn't work, or if there's an electrical problem, there's nothing you can do about that. So what you really want is a mechanical organ that can be hand pumped. Then this guy would be out of work if we had that. But now we have these fancy electrical things, and millions of things go wrong with organs nowadays. Yes, ma'am.
Could you say something about our organ here in the chapel? I know sometimes that we have trouble with it when the weather changes, and also sometimes notes play unexpectedly.
Well, it's a very nice organ, and I think fits very well in that. It's the right size organ for that building. Although I would never want to put an organ sideways in the chancel. I would want to put an organ on the east end or the west end or something like that, so it speaks down the length of the nave. But that nobody pays any attention to me anyway. Of course, there are wind chests that are made out of wood and leather, like a bellows, and anything that's made out of wood or leather or whatever thing can be affected by humidity and temperature. And it also goes out, temperature makes organs go out of tune. An organ is in tune only at one temperature. If it goes up higher, it goes a little bit out of tune. If it goes way higher, some things go out of tune more than others because different stops work different ways. Some of them work like policemen's whistles, and some of them work like oboes with reeds in them, some are made out of metal and some are made out of wood, so the organ doesn't go out of tune. If it all just went north exactly the same amount, it would sound fine, but it doesn't. So it's usually things that are supposed to move that won't move for some reason. And usually it's when they swell rather than when they shrink. Bill?
Tom, what's the relationship historically between Notre Dame and Saint Denis? I think of Saint Denis as the more important historically. Is that true?
Saint Denis, they say, Abbot Suger, the abbot of the Royal Abbey of Saint Denis, which is a little ways north of Paris, in a pretty bad suburb now, but you should go if you haven't been to Saint Denis, is the place where the idea of constructing arches with pointed arches like this, which allow for things to be they don't have to be rounded this way so they can go up much higher. It was his architects, Suger's architects, that did the first to do that on a substantial scale. So people actually say that Saint Denis is the first Gothic building. And all of the other stuff that follows from that, the repeating units and stuff like that, all of that stuff was also available in the Romanesque style with rounded arches. But the pointed arches allow for, I'm way out over the tips of my skis here, but it's the first Gothic building, and the main feature of Gothic that distinguishes it from Romanesque is the pointed arch, which allows for a higher general thing.
But it was also the burial place of the kings.
That's right.
Why was there a need for Notre Dame after Saint Denis if Saint Denis was the big thing, but outside of the center of Paris?
Well, there was a cathedral on this. There was a cathedral on this spot before. Saint Denis is not a cathedral. Saint Denis is the place where Saint Denis, once he had his head chopped off, picked up his head and walked outside of Paris to there, and that's where he's buried. And they built a church and a monastery there, and the kings of France have been buried at Saint Denis. But it's not a cathedral. And a cathedral does well to be in the city that it serves, and because it has all the parishes. So there were other cathedrals, the Saint Geneviève and other things that preceded this one. They just said, let's have a great big cathedral here, and we'll get rid of all these other churches that were on the spot. I think those of us that are going to church better kind of get our church shoes on, don't you think? I'm going home.